Every so often, we read headlines talking about an upcoming event in outer space referred to as blood moon. Often, there are faith leaders who say that they believe that this is a sign of the end times. But what do you think? We are going to chat about that a little bit today with Dr. Jeff Zweerink, who joins us from Southern California. He is an astrophysicist, a project professor with UCLA, and a senior research scholar with Reasons to Believe, which is a Christian organization that combines science with faith. So welcome to Bridge City News, Dr. Zweerink. It's great to have you on today.
Well, I'm glad to be here. Really looking forward to our conversation today.
Awesome. So first of all, for any viewers unfamiliar with a blood moon or a ring of fire, can you explain what these phenomena are?
Yeah, they're two different but related phenomena. And so we live in at least as far as the immediate thing, we live here on Earth. There's the moon and there's the sun, and all of the light in our system comes from the sun. But occasionally, one of those objects will block the light from the other. So as the sun shines, reflects light off the moon comes back to the Earth. That's how we see the moon at night. Occasionally, the Earth will get in between the sun and the moon, and it will cause an eclipse. And so this is what leads to the blood moon. And you think, okay, if the sun or the Earth is blocking all the light from the sun reaching the moon, it would just be black. But that's not quite true, because if you think about how a sunset happens, things get very red. Well, that's because the light traveling through the atmosphere, light goes through our atmosphere, kind of gets bent around, and it's just the red light that gets to the moon. So it actually kind of makes this red hue. And so it turns into a blood moon. And so that's one of those phenomena that we're referring to. The other, the Ring of Fire, I think is actually a more spectacular event, because that's where the moon gets in between the Earth and the sun and causes a solar eclipse. And so the moon sometimes isn't quite large enough in the sky to block out the whole sun. And so you just get the bulk of the sun blacked out, but you get a ring of light around it that you can see, and that's what's the Ring of Fire. So there are two different kinds of eclipses that can happen that are really pretty spectacular to watch.
So when are the next blood moon and ring of fire events going to take place, and where on the planet will we be able to observe these?
So the next blood moon, or the next lunar eclipse, actually happens on May 26th of this year. And well, it's one that is visible kind of from the northeast region of the Americas. So kind of Seattle, Washington, that sort of area going north of there. That's May 26th. And that's going to be visible for quite some time. A lunar eclipse takes hours to happen. And so if you're anywhere where it's nighttime where that's happening, you're going to be able to see that. The Ring of Fire, that's a little bit harder to see. That's going to be visible kind of northeastern Canada, kind of start in Ontario, move up towards Greenland and over to Russia. That's the path it's going to take. The Ring of Fire aspect of it, it's only going to last for maybe tops 4 minutes. So they happen on very different timescales, and that's going to happen, I think it's June 10th of 2021. And again, that's visible kind of Canada, Greenland, over into Russia.
Right. So both of those coming up soon. Like you were saying, May 26th and then June 10th. Mark your calendars, especially if you live in that area of the world. Now, how often do these types of eclipses happen, especially in tandem like this?
Well, the reality of it is every year there's anywhere from 4 to 7 eclipses. So we tend to think of them being very rare. And often why they're rare is because it's to see a solar eclipse is kind of rare, because though they happen anywhere from 2 to 5 times a year, just a solar eclipse, they only happen over a very small portion of the United States. So, I've been around for at least 5 decades, and I have seen 3 solar eclipses in my life. One I had to travel 500 or 800 miles to get to. So those are kind of rare for any individual part of the world to see, but eclipses happen all the time. So the reality of it is this isn't a particularly rare event, but for any one person to see both of them, it is a little bit unusual.
Oh, for sure. Now, you as a Christian astrophysicist who has a scientific mind and also a heart of faith, how do events like this impact you personally?
Well, I'm just kind of fascinated as a scientist on eclipses. I mean, I have seen many lunar eclipses. Like I said, those happen kind of twice a year. Whether you can see them or not is always a little bit. But I remember my parents, when I'm 5, 6 years old, would get us up at 2, 3 in the morning to watch the lunar eclipse, and we'd watch for 15, 20 minutes, half hour, and then go back to bed. I'll get my kids up to do that. So I mean, as many as I've seen, I'll still go out and see them. The opportunity to see a solar eclipse, especially one where you've got a total eclipse, that is hands down one of the most spectacular events I've ever seen. I traveled in 2017 up into Oregon to see the one that happened. And as much stuff as I've seen in my life, I have never seen anything like that. So they're just very spectacular events to watch. I also like them from the science perspective, because there are things we can learn about the heavens because eclipses happen. And it's kind of interesting when you think how large the moon is and how small the moon is, that if you were to actually look at them in the sky, they take up about the same region of space in the sky. So there's some kind of interesting science that comes out of what we can learn by looking at eclipses.
How small the moon is compared to which?
Well, so the sun is you could put 10 times, I think there's 100, you could put 100 Earths across the diameter of the sun. The moon is much smaller than the Earth, but when you look at them in the sky, you can actually cover them up with your thumb. You got to be careful doing that with the sun, because you don't really want to look at it. But your thumb will cover both of them, because they're about the same angular size in the sky.
Isn't that fascinating? That's amazing stuff to me. I love outer space and stuff. It's fascinating to me. Now, the Bible does speak of celestial signs related to prophecy, doesn't it? So in Joel 2:31, it says, "The sun shall be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the day of the Lord comes." So there's also a similar verse in Acts 2:20 that says, and also in the book of Revelation, right? Chapter 6, verse 12. So what are we supposed to make of these verses? How do we know if one of these celestial events is actually referring to the return of Jesus?
Well, I think when I look at those, one thing that is abundantly clear, that is hands down taught throughout Scripture, is that Christ is going to return, and and when it happens, it will be obvious and known to all. And so some spectacular things are going to occur in the heavens. The sun's going to be darkened, the moon's going to be turned to blood. What I don't know that that's referring to eclipses, although that may be a part of it. Part of why I don't think or what we need to be careful about with eclipses is that eclipses are pretty regular and common. In fact, we can predict when eclipses are going to happen, when they're going to occur together, what they're going to look like in the sky, everything like that. And the Bible also makes it abundantly clear we don't know when Christ will return, but when it happens, it will be known to everybody. So I'm a little cautious about making signs of, oh, this eclipse means that Christ's going to return, because we can predict when all the eclipses are going to happen and where they're going to happen and what they're going to look like. But I do think it's important to remember that, when Christ returns, it's going to be obvious. The sun's going to be darkened, the moon will appear red. I think that's probably referring less to eclipses and more to catastrophic events occurring in the atmosphere, maybe a large volcanic eruption, but it's going to be very obvious when Christ returns. I think that's the main point of what those passages are about. And if we're aware of the signs, we're going to be recognizing when it's happening.
Interesting. Very interesting. Now, the Bible was written for everybody, past, present, and future, but it was written to specific people, wasn't it? So, for example, the church of Ephesus, or perhaps for those living in Israel, is it possible that any celestial signs the Bible speaks of need to be ones that can be observed either in those specific areas on Earth, or perhaps everywhere on the planet, as opposed to just a few nations around the globe? It's so up for debate, isn't it?
I think that's a pretty important point. I think we need to be very careful how we read Scripture. I know there was a few years ago, somebody was talking about there's a sequence of 4 moons that happen to occur on various holy days, and saying, okay, this is something important. The reality is that happens. There's a regularity with how that happens throughout history. But what was interesting is that at least a couple of those eclipses, those blood moons, were not visible from the nation of Israel. And so what would that mean if Israel, it's daytime when they're occurring? That wouldn't be a sign to them. And so I do think we need to be pretty careful. Again, I think what Scripture is abundantly clear about is that there will be Christ's return. That's going to happen. That's not a metaphorical or something like that. He's going to return, and when it happens, it will be abundantly obvious. And as Christians, we're supposed to be prepared and ready for that in terms of telling others about the gospel, of seeing his work in the heavens. We're not supposed to be sitting around divining what time that's going to come by what's going on in the heavens. And so I think that's the distinction we need to make. Enjoy the heavens, appreciate the just splendor and majesty that the heavens reveal, but don't try and pin down when the date where Christ is going to return by eclipses, because God said we're not going to know when it happens. We can't predict when it happens, but we'll know when it happens.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let me throw another question at you. This is kind of controversial, but was the Star of Bethlehem a real celestial event pointing towards the birth of Jesus? Is there a scientific explanation behind that?
Yeah, I very much do think it was an actual event. You've got places in Scripture where it's recorded as, again, not telling metaphorical stories of the wise men in the east saw the star and came to Jerusalem to find the king. So this is something that was being recorded. Now, the question is, what is that celestial event? What I think, at least for a long time when I thought about the Star of Bethlehem, it's this big beaming light beam shining down where everybody was going to see it. The reality of it was, if you go again, read Scripture carefully, which is, I think we need to do that no matter what we're looking at. But when the wise men got to Jerusalem, they inquired of Herod, and of all the people in Jerusalem, nobody really remembered the event of what had happened there. So it was something that was visible to people who were looking carefully in the heavens, but not so obvious that everybody saw it. And so I'm inclined to think it's maybe some sort of eclipse, or not an eclipse, but a conjunction. It may be a recurring novae. There are plausible scientific explanations of what it might have been. Scripture hasn't made it clear enough that we can put a definite answer to that. But yeah, those were definite events that led things to happen. And again, I think you can even, when you look at that, those wise men were probably spiritual descendants of Daniel looking forward to the coming of the Messiah. So I think that all wraps up and says that Scripture really does talk to what happens in the real world. We can be confident that what it describes of the real world is accurate and true. And because that's true, we can trust the things that it says about the spiritual realm that we can't see.
Oh, so interesting. Any final advice for how Christians should interpret celestial events and phenomena like blood moons?
I think we should be fascinated by how God has revealed himself through the heavens. Learn about what they mean in two things. One, because the more I learn about how eclipses happen and novae and all of these things, the more fascinated I am with how big and powerful and mighty God is. But it also keeps me from being drawn into speculation that is often incorrect. When Christopher Columbus came to the New World, part of the thing he did is he used an eclipse to trick the people in the world to take care of him. We don't want to be easily tricked as Christians. So we need to read and be careful, aware of the science and how things work, so that we can appreciate God's splendor and majesty, but not be taken advantage of by those who want to use celestial events for their personal gain.
Mm-hmm. Great advice. Thanks so much for being with us today, Dr. Zweerink. Thanks so much for sharing your knowledge there. It was very fascinating to hear.
Really enjoyed being here. Thanks for the invitation.
Dr. Jeff Zweerink is an astrophysicist with reasons to believe. I'm Jeanette Roche on behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News. Thanks for watching.